Nobody can agree on what a top 25 ranking should be in college football. This is an issue that has been going on for a long time and is really highlighted by how terrible the AP poll is. The only thing people can seem to agree upon is that that ranking really sucks, and yet that's the most uniform ranking and the ranking we go with. And so, whenever you sit down and try to talk to someone about, okay, what should a top 25 be? Nobody can seem to agree. And this is an interesting disconnect because I think it's pretty simple. There's a story of what people want top 25 rankings to be versus what they have been and what a lot of people's takes are on them. So we're going to look at all of the different takes on what a ranking should be and my thoughts, what I think is the best way going forward and the best way to do ranking. So let's start with the purely resume-based ranking. I think this is the one where in an ideal, perfect world, most people might agree this is what it should be. If you look at this little meter, we've got it down at the bottom here, it's resume on one side, rating on the other side. This is purely resume-based, so 100% all resume. That would be the only thing that matters in a ranking like this. So here you can see I've taken them all and I've ranked them in order of what their current resume is in terms of the strength of their wins with their losses weighed in as well. It doesn't matter how good a team is or how good they're rated. This is purely only for wins and losses. Now, I'm sure by looking at this, you can already see some of the flaws, some of the critiques that you might have there. There's some prominent teams missing that we know are really good teams, but not in this ranking. So some of the main complaints here might be somebody looks at BYU at 7th because of their resume and says, so you think BYU would beat Alabama? Alabama would be favored by so much more than BYU on a neutral field. It's silly to have them ranked above Alabama. Somebody might also say, what if an elite roster has only played cupcakes? Prior to this week, Penn State did just lose to Oregon, but before that, they had only beaten up on cupcake teams. Do they deserve to be ranked even though they haven't beaten anyone? They have no resume. And on top of that, what counts as a good win in this scenario? Is it only purely resume based? Like, for example, if BYU were to beat Texas, do we count that as a good win for BYU, or does it not count because Texas isn't ranked in a system like this? So there's a few conundrums and complaints that come up. In my opinion, what a ranking that's purely resume-based should be used for is a measure of how impressive a team's season has been thus far. That's really the main thing. This should be used to see how good the resume is, to be used as a reference point for when you're creating a ranking, because I don't think a ranking should just be purely resume. This should calculate the strength of their resume. I think it should be weighed pretty heavily, but I do not think this should be the end-all be-all, and I do think context is important, so I don't think this is what a ranking should be. With that being said, let's take a look at our second philosophy here, and it's not much of a philosophy. It's just the AP poll, which one of the main things is that there's no guiding philosophy for the AP poll. It seems like guys are just ranking it based on their own things. There's no one uniform way that the voters are being told, hey, by the way, this should be your guiding philosophy. People just kind of do what they feel like. And I do kind of like that to a degree just for the tradition of it all. And I do think the AP poll should staying around just because of the historic context of it. But this leads to bigger brands getting the benefit of the doubt. And there's just always an inconsistency in logic in the AP poll. Them respecting head-to-head in one spot, but not respecting it in another. A team just beats a team, but they're still not ranked above them, even though they're in close proximity in the poll. That kinds of stuff happens all the time. I said that they weight about 60% teams' ratings, 40% resume, but I think that's giving AP poll voters too much of a benefit of the doubt. I really don't think most of them have a real guiding philosophy, and that's one of the biggest flaws of the AP poll and why most people hate the AP poll. Some of the main complaints are a lot of the stuff we just talked about. Nothing makes sense. There's excessive recency bias, meaning the AP poll voters have this mentality that drives me crazy, which is when a team loses, they're required to drop a certain number of spots because of that loss. And when a team wins a big game, they're required to rise a certain number of spots without even factoring in the context of what happened around them. It always just seems to happen. People just have this mental block about comparing this week's rankings to the next week's rankings in terms of how high they rise and fall based on what they did. I don't think they necessarily have to drop or rise, especially if the context of their resume changed as well. For example, Florida State drops all the way to 18th because they lost to Virginia. However, their win over Alabama got even more impressive because the Crimson Tide beat Georgia. I think that should be considered. Instead, it's not really considered. It's not recent, so they don't evaluate it as heavily. Recency bias is really crazy here, and obviously the big brand bias we talked about. How it should be used, the AP poll, I think it's a fun way to get a general idea for how the team is ranked. It's the one ranking everybody can agree on to use as the standard, even though nobody really likes it. So to be able to say, yes, Penn State's the 7th ranked team in the country, at least that is a fact, even if you don't necessarily agree with it. So that's good. The AP poll really should be destroyed, but it's the only agreed upon ranking that we have. I think it's fun. This also ties into the preseason rankings conversation. I'm a big fan of preseason rankings, but we'll touch on that a little bit more later as well. Let's get to the next ranking philosophy that we have. This is going to be power ratings. This is 100% rating, 0% resume. There's no resume baked into this at all. Instead, it is just the rating of a team. How good are they? It's purely based on the best teams, regardless of resume, neutral field favorability. This is what Vegas uses to set their lines for the game. This is an example of the Josh Pate poll or the JP poll. He has a great college football show, and this is how he does it. He does a top 20 instead of a top 25, kind of a throwback to how it used to be. There used to not be 25, but he just bases it on how good they are according to the rating systems. A lot of people are going to look at this and not like this because they see Notre Dame with 2 losses at 8th, and it makes them uncomfortable. Obviously, this shouldn't be really used as a ranking. Some of the main complaints here is that people confuse this with a ranking. I know it's a little confusing because I kind of described it as a ranking. It is kind of a ranking because it's teams ranked in order, but really it is a rating system where he's rating each team. Only minor tweaks are made to the team's profile for their results. For example, if Notre Dame played teams 1 through 7 and lost every single game by 3 points, they probably wouldn't move at all because they'd be saying, yeah, they're playing like the 8th best team in the country. Yes, they didn't beat any of the 7 teams rated above them. However, in a ranking, you would argue you keep losing, you should probably drop. And I agree with that. But this model doesn't care about wins and losses. It cares about your performance and how it measures up versus your expectations. How it should be used? I think that a model like this, a rating system, should be used to calculate the strength of a win or a loss, looking at the rating of the team you beat, and it should be used obviously for betting purposes. But for example, the Florida Gators have lost 3 games on the season, and yet if Florida, you look at their talent roster, it's a really excellent talent roster. They're probably not going to be rated as a top 20 team anymore, but just because Florida isn't holding up their end of the bargain and is losing all those games doesn't mean it's not a quality win. A better example would be Notre Dame. Miami, Texas A&M both beat Notre Dame. Since Notre Dame has 2 losses, they dropped to like 22nd in the AP poll. Some people argue they shouldn't be ranked, but does that suddenly not a quality win for Miami and Texas A&M? Is Notre Dame bad now because they've lost 2 games? No, it just means they played a tough schedule. They're still rated as the 8th best team. So I think that's how resumes should be calculated is you look at that and you say, wow, Texas A&M got a win over the 8th best rated team in the country. Notre Dame shouldn't be ranked above them. Obviously, A&M should be ranked above them, but the fact that Notre Dame is rated so high makes that a really impressive victory. So that being done, we're going to go to the final ranking philosophy, which is my own. We're going to end with what I believe a ranking should look like and how it should look like. So here's a look at my latest top 25. My current philosophy for a ranking boils down to about 70% resume and about 30% rating is what I think the right balance is for a top 25. I think it should be a balance between what they've actually done, what their resume is, and also how good we do know a team is. Obviously, you can only take that so far. If Texas were to lose 4 games this season, it doesn't matter how good we think they are. They don't have a good resume, and they should be dropped accordingly. But this is what rankings always have been and always should be, in my opinion, because this really is not, we're not in a pretend world, right? You could say, look at Penn State, look at Texas. They have no quality wins. They've only beaten Group of 5 in FCS competition, and they both lost their biggest game to Oregon and Ohio State. You could drop them out of their top 25 and completely justify it with that philosophy. But in my opinion, it's incredibly silly to look at 2 teams that we know have elite talent rosters that both showed up in their big games versus Oregon and Ohio State, played them tougher than basically anybody else could, and just say, yeah, they're not a top 10 team. I think it should matter that your team is rated very highly and that your team is still pretty good, especially if you haven't taken that many losses. Again, this is with a heavy weighting of resume in here. I don't think they should be any higher than that. In fact, you could argue a little lower based on the fact that they don't have much of a resume. But I like having them at a higher ranking because I think it's also relevant and important for the context of a win. If Texas Tech were to beat number 8 Texas, I like the fact that Texas is number 8 because we know they're really good. It would be a lot different if Texas was 22nd because they don't have a quality win. And then, okay, Texas Tech beats them, and nobody's going to treat that as a fair win. A little bit of that has to do with the fact that most people look at ranking and not rating when they're looking at wins and losses. And so that's almost my way of offsetting that a little bit. Some of the major complaints here are people that say it should be 100% resume. There should be no big brand bias. There should be no rating stuff baked in. It should just be 100% resume. And to me, I think that's silly because you run into the conundrum where the Oregon Ducks, for example, would not have been ranked last week. They beat Penn State and now suddenly they're a top 2 team in the country. If you're doing 100% resume, that's literally how you do it. If you're doing solely resume, you're going to end up with a crazy flip-flopping poll that has no consistency week to week. And to me, including that 30% rating gives it just a little bit more consistency that makes it actually make sense and stay a little bit consistent. I also don't think big brand bias is as much of an issue. It's still going to bake in a little bit. That's going to be a complaint. There's also disagreements about how head-to-head should be valued. For me, I think when the resumes are comparable at all, head-to-head should be respected. That's why I have Florida State above Bama, Bama above Georgia, Virginia. I don't think their resume is super comparable because that loss to NC State is a really bad loss for them. NC State has a Swiss cheese defense and isn't a very good team. We just watched them lose at home to Virginia Tech. That's the reason why the Hokies aren't getting their head-to-head respected versus Florida State. I don't think the resumes are super comparable. And there's always the people that say, like, so you're saying Vandy would beat Notre Dame looking at this? Those are just, pretty much idiots, basically. But yeah, that's what my major philosophy is. I have some other hard stances on rankings, and I thought, what better place to go over that than a video like this? I think that teams, and I talked about this earlier, shouldn't be required to drop or rise a certain number based on a win or a loss. It really matters on the context of what happened around them, what teams lost around them, what teams won around them, and also the context of their resume. I talked about it earlier. Yes, Florida State is coming off a loss to Virginia. It was in double overtime on the road. Virginia looks like a solid team, but also Florida State also beat Alabama. There shouldn't be this insane recency bias. That's still a win they got. You compare the two resumes. Bama and Florida State both have really excellent wins over teams that are very highly rated, and they both have tough losses. Bama lost at Florida State. Florida State lost in double overtime at Virginia. I think the Noles head-to-head should still matter over Alabama at that point. Bama over Georgia is not as hot of a take. Most people would agree on that one, but I really think it should matter, and I don't think you should be required to drop or rise a certain number of spots on wins or losses. Quality wins, I think, should really matter. Those should be treated with respect. Getting quality wins should really help you. I think resumes should adjust. Kind of alluded to that a little bit, but for example, with a team like LSU, right? You beat Clemson when they're a top 5 team or whatever it was. You get another win over Florida when they're, just outside the top 25 at that point because they lost South Florida. The resume should adjust. Obviously, that win over LSU doesn't look as impressive anymore, but that should also swing the other way. If your win ends up looking more impressive in hindsight, that should be considered as well. Head-to-head should really matter. I already talked about it. And it also should not be predictive. For example, you should not have a team like, let's say, Georgia still in the top 5 because you're predicting that they're going to have a good rest of the season. I don't think that's the guiding philosophy that should exist. So that's pretty much it. Stance on preseason rankings is, like I talked about before, preseason rankings are really cool. I think they're awesome. Having that ranking next to the team logo is part of the fun of college football. It's part of the fun of those early season results. I think it all evens out in the end, and the fact that we have CFP rankings to sort of switch it up in the middle of the season, I really think it's a good reset, and I think it gets rid of a lot of the preseason biases, which, by the way, if there was no preseason rankings, those preseason biases would still exist. It's not like getting rid of preseason rankings would just completely resolve that. People would still have their own formed opinions and biases that already exist. Anyways, that is all for this video. I just wanted to pop on here and talk about a hot button topic, which has been top 25s. How should they work? How should they be treated? And I thought it was much needed because there's a lot of discourse that comes out every week I drop the top 25 rankings. And so I'm just addressing some key things here. That's all I've got for today. As usual, if you have not joined the CF Budge Discord already, I'm going to link that down in the bio. It's been popping recently. It's been absolutely awesome. Over 1,000 people in there just talking football every week. YouTube is the #1 hub for getting new members on that, which is something that surprised me, but I absolutely love how engaged you guys are on this channel. It really makes me happy to see. I've got all my Week 6 predictions coming out later this week. I might do another long-form video. That one up in the air. Obviously, you'll see if that one goes up. But that's all I got for you guys in today's video. I appreciate you guys for watching. If you made it this far, obviously you did watch. And that's all I got for today. I will see you guys later this week.